Hi, class. This week we are studying epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge. And philosophers who focus on epistemology ask questions like, what conditions must be met to say that someone has knowledge of something? So a famous philosophical debate emerged in the 1600s is still relevant today about whether knowledge depends on the mind or the senses. So philosophers who argue that knowledge depends on the mind are known as rationalists. And Rene Descartes, his meditations on first philosophy lay out the groundwork for a rationalist theory of knowledge. Let's first put Descartes into context. So he was born in 1596, about 50 years after Copernicus dies, who helped forward the heliocentric view of the world, which is the view that the Earth circles the sun rather than that the sun circles the Earth. And Descartes was alive when Galileo confirmed that theory with his telescope. And he was alive when Kepler was making discoveries about planetary motion that was turning science on its head. So Descartes is living at a time where the world as it appears to us is turning out to be something totally different. So for instance, it appears that the sun moves around the earth each day, but this is our senses playing tricks on us. And we are actually in motion around the sun. So Descartes' goal was to find a secure ground from which to build up the sciences. He wants to start with a proposition that cannot possibly be doubted and build up knowledge about the world from it. So by starting with a logically indisputable proposition and using deductive reasoning to ascertain other truths about the world, he thinks he can arrive at certainty, certain knowledge. So something to note about valid deductive logic is that it follows forms such as if all the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true by necessity. So for instance, this is a valid deductive argument form. If all A are B and all B are C, then all A are C. And you can plug in any values for A, B, and C, and if the two premises that you come up with are true, the conclusion has to be true. For instance, this argument follows the form, has all true premises and has a conclusion that follows with necessity. If all dogs are mammals and all mammals are warm-blooded, then all dogs are warm-blooded. There's no way to deny that conclusion if you accept the two premises. And there are many other valid deductive argument forms, but this makes the point. If you use valid deductive reasoning, as Descartes intends to do, and you have premises that are indisputable, you will arrive at conclusions that are indisputable. So his first task is to identify a first premise that cannot possibly be doubted. So one thing to note is that we all have a lot of beliefs. In the spirit of Plato and the allegory of the cave that we talked about in week 1, we all are in the presence of shadows, you might say. We believe many things, things that we've been told are true, but things that turn out not to be true. Thinking again about Descartes' time, at one point it was believed that the earth was the center of the universe, and now it appears it isn't. So who's to say that our current beliefs won't be proven false as well one day? Note that Newtonian physics was replaced by Einsteinian physics just in this last century. So we must identify what it is that our beliefs rest on and test that. So Descartes noted that most of our beliefs come from the senses. Our sight, our taste, touch, and so on. Think about why people thought the earth was the center of the universe. Descartes wrote, "Whatever I have so far accepted as supremely true, I have learned either from the senses or through the senses. But I have occasionally caught the senses deceiving me, and it would be prudent for me never to completely trust those who have cheated me even once. So our senses deceive us at times and have deceived us, for instance, about the Earth's position. But what about a more immediate sense, like we sense that we have bodies? Descartes wrote, "But while my senses may deceive me about what is small or far away, there may still be other things taken in by the senses which I cannot possibly doubt, such as that I am here, sitting before the fire, wearing a dressing gown, touching this paper. Indeed, these hands and the rest of my body, on what grounds might I deny that they exist?" So now he's questioning whether he can doubt that he actually has a body. Is it possible to doubt that I have a physical body? Well, Descartes challenges us to consider dreams. We often believe that we are in a different place with a different body, with different sensations, when we are actually in a bed dreaming. So Descartes writes, "How often a dream has convinced me that I was here, sitting before the fire, wearing my dressing gown, when, in fact, I was undressed and between the covers of my bed." So in dreams, the objects of our experience are made of the same stuff as the objects of our waking life. Our consciousness conceives of corporeal nature, which is to say bodies. It conceives of things as being extended, having the shape of extended objects, having quantity, size. There are a number of objects. There's a place for them to exist in, and there's a concept of time in dreams. So Descartes argues then that we can doubt that any of these attributes actually exist because we at times think they exist when we're actually sleeping. And we can't be sure we aren't sleeping right now or haven't been sleeping all along. So he says we can't even be sure that corporeal nature exists or that our bodies exist. So we might be dreaming right now and not realize it. So everything Descartes has found doubt in so far refers to the senses, or our individual perceptions that have been proven to be flawed in the past. So what about analytic truths, a truth whose negation is a contradiction? For instance, the truth that all bachelors are unmarried men. That's an analytic truth, because unmarried men is the very definition of bachelor. So if you can't negate this claim without falling into a contradiction, for instance, you can't say it's not the case that all bachelors are unmarried men, because you contradict the very essence of what it means to be a bachelor. So Descartes wrote, "Whether we are awake or asleep, 2 plus 3 is always 5, and the square has never had more than 4 sides. It seems impossible even to suspect such obvious truths of falsity." However, Descartes imagines a scenario where even analytic truths can be doubted. So imagine that God has the power to put anything in our minds, including false analytic truths. So this God could have us believe that 2 plus 2 equals 4, when in fact 2 plus 2 equals 5. If the nature of God is to be all-powerful, then God can do anything, including deceive us about mathematics and analytic truths. So it might be the case that in actuality, all bachelors are not unmarried men. That's a possibility, according to Descartes. Now, note that it's highly probable that our senses give us the truth, and that we are awake right now and we're not dreaming, and that analytic truths are true. But it can still be doubted, and that's the point. Descartes wants a foundation that cannot possibly be doubted. So let's not only doubt these things, but flatly deny them. We will assume that we are being tricked about analytic truths, and that 2 plus 2 actually equals 5, and that we are asleep, and nothing we experience with the senses is real. If it can be doubted, Descartes has us just reject it as a starting point. Now, one could counter that God is good, so God wouldn't deceive us. So let's deny God's existence and use another thought experiment, another possible scenario. An evil genius is manipulating us. So the evil genius has my brain in a vat and is manipulating it to believe analytic truths that are actually false and to have sense perceptions that don't at all reflect reality. You might think about The Matrix right now. The movie The Matrix, people were basically brains in a vat. What actually was happening didn't reflect at all their experience in the Matrix, the world that they thought was real. And in that movie, they were being deceived by an evil force. So Descartes writes, I will suppose then, not that there is a supremely good God who is the source of all truth, but that there is an evil demon, supremely powerful and cunning, who works as hard as he can to deceive me. So this all leaves us with a lot of doubts. I doubt that I have a body. I doubt that 2 + 2 = 4. I doubt that the physical world exists. I even doubt that there is a God. We come then to something that can't be doubted, that I am having doubts. In other words, I must exist, as there is an I that is possibly being deceived. This is a truth that can't be doubted. If you doubt it, you've asserted your existence again, because there must be a thinking thing that exists that is doing the doubting. So even if we're being deceived, there's a thinking thing, the I, that is the being that's being deceived. So we've settled on a first proposition for our understanding of the world. I think, so I exist. So now we must look at what this I is. We still haven't relieved our doubts about our bodies or our corporeal nature. So the I that we're talking about, it can't be the body. So here we encounter what's called Cartesian dualism, that the mind and the body are distinct substances. The mind refers to consciousness, and it has experiences, and this is the I. As long as the I exists, the I has experience. So consciousness does things like it doubts, it understands, it asserts, it denies, it's willing or unwilling, it has sensations, and it has imagination. Whether awake or asleep, awake or dreaming, I exist as a conscious being. Okay? The body is corporeal, so it's extended in time and space, it needs nutrition, it has locomotion. These are all potentially unreal, as they may be figments of our imagination, but we still have a conscious experience of them. So what is the nature of bodies? Descartes uses wax to help investigate this. He says, quote, take, for example, this piece of wax. It has just been taken from the honeycomb. It still smells of the flowers from which it was gathered. Its color, shape, and size are obvious. It is hard, cold, and easy to touch. It makes a sound when wrapped. In short, everything required for me to have distinct knowledge of a physical object seems to be present. But, as I speak, I move the wax towards the fire. It loses what was left of its taste. It gives up its smell. It changes color. It loses its shape. It gets bigger. It melts. It heats up. It becomes difficult to touch. It no longer makes a sound when struck. So is it the same piece of wax? End of quote. So Descartes argues that it is the same piece of wax, but its changes reveal something about it as a substance. What we can know about wax is not what is derived from the senses, but what lies underneath its appearances. So what we experience when we work with the wax is the thing for me. This is the thing we experience. What the wax actually is a thing in itself, a thing that exists outside of my mind. We then see a great rift between the world as we experience it and the world as it actually is. There's a divide there. We can know, we can experience things, but we can't know the thing in itself. Okay? It's on that basis that we can't trust the knowledge that we receive from the senses. And so we can still doubt that the world as we experience it even exists. We might still be brains in a vat manipulated by an evil demon because we can't go from the thing in my mind to the thing in itself. So Descartes, it doesn't want to leave us as radical skeptics, only believing in our own existence and nothing more. So as a good Christian, he sets out to prove the existence of God. And if that God is an all-good God, then it won't deceive us. And we can be certain that we aren't brains in a vat being deceived at every moment. Descartes writes, quote, "I must examine whether there is a God, and if so, whether he can be a deceiver. Without knowing this, I am unable to be quite certain of anything else beyond my existence," basically. So to do this, we must first look at what's required for knowledge. So, I exist, I am, is knowledge, according to Descartes. And why is that? Ultimately, Descartes argues, it's a clear and distinct idea. So Descartes writes, "Whatever I perceive very clearly and distinctly is true." Now, for Descartes, a clear and distinct perception is not given by the senses. It's given through reason or through clear logical thinking. And note that it was contradictory to think that I don't exist, as there must be a thinking thing that exists in order to do all this doubting that he was doing. That's a argument based on reason and logic. So he writes, quote, "Earth, sky, stars, and the rest of what I got from the senses. Now what did I clearly perceive about them? Only that the ideas or thoughts of such things occurred in my mind." So he argues that we don't need to doubt ideas. What we need to doubt is judgments. For example, we have the idea that a desk is in front of us, but what we need to doubt is the judgment that that desk exists outside of the idea of it or outside of our minds. Descartes doubts the latter, not the former. The former shows us that we are a thinking thing, a thing that has experience. So he asks us to look at the ideas within us. And he writes, quote, "Of my ideas, some seem to be innate, others acquired, and others produced by me," end quote. So one thing is certain. Our ideas come from something. Some are clearly my own creations, such as dreams or the idea of a unicorn, for instance. Some could have come from an external source, like sensations of the thing in itself. But seemingly all perceptions of the physical world could have originated with me. They could all be a dream that I've created. So Descartes writes, "And as to my ideas of physical objects, it seems that nothing in them is so great that it couldn't have come from me." So all ideas so far that he's thought of could be our own inventions, our own dreams or hallucinations. Because ideas come from somewhere, either myself or something external to me like an evil demon, it logically follows that the cause of our experience is as much reality as the effect. So that leads Descartes to posit that there are representative modes of existence, which refer to experience, sensations, and ideas, and actual modes of existence, which refer to the cause of experience, whether it be things in the world like trees and tables, or an evil genius manipulating my mind, or my hallucinations, or me dreaming, or God putting ideas in my mind. This means that we have ideas of corporeal objects, and we have clear and distinct ideas associated with these objects. Corporeal nature then has extension, which includes length, width, depth, position in space and time, boundaries, and is a substance of some sort. These are all features of a substance that doesn't change. They are inherent to the nature of a substance. Descartes notes that we also experience properties in objects that aren't clear and distinct, such as qualities like colors, hot and cold, odors, and sounds. These are experienced in obscure, confused ways because they do change, as we saw with the wax. The temperature of the wax changes, the odor changes, the color changes, and so on as it moves towards the fire. So, for example, the table has a length, width, and a weight. We can come to know these attributes clearly at any time. It also has a color and a temperature. These change constantly given the light in the room, the temperature of the room at any time or day, and whether, for instance, I'm wearing glasses or not. So, the important thing to gather here is that the cause is as real as the effect. Now, Descartes argues that there is one clear and distinct idea that we have that couldn't have originated in us. And this is the idea of infinity. So, why could this not have come from us? Well, humans are finite. We don't know everything. We don't have experience of time going on forever. We don't have experience of numbers going on endlessly. And yet we can intuit the idea of infinity. So the only way we could have the effect of having an idea of infinity is if some infinite being caused the idea to be planted in us. And Descartes argues that is God, an all-powerful, all-knowing, infinite being. Now, it's important to question whether Descartes' proof works. The proof is crucial to his philosophy because by arguing deductively and through reason that God, an infinite being, must exist, we can then start to trust that there is an actual world outside of our minds that resembles the world in our minds. And we are not being deceived by an evil demon. And we are not dreaming or hallucinating. And this is because God is infinitely good. And an infinitely good God would not deceive us. So Descartes' proof of the existence of God is very similar to a proof offered centuries prior by St. Anselm, and it goes like this. God is that which nothing greater can exist. It's a definition of what God is. We have an understanding of God in our minds. Perhaps God exists only as a concept in our minds. It is greater to actually exist than to exist only in our minds. So, God cannot exist in our minds because, if he did, something greater than God could exist. And by the definition of God, God is that which nothing greater can exist. So, basically, he defines God's nature as being the greatest thing possible. And if that idea in our mind only existed as an idea, then God wouldn't be the greatest thing that could exist. Let me know if you have any questions about this proof, but it resembles Descartes' argument quite a bit. So, now many have argued that Descartes' proof of the existence of God does not hold up because humans could have constructed the idea of infinity in our minds through our experiences. which could at their root be deceptions that are planted by an evil genius if we take Descartes' argument seriously. Where Descartes has been most influential is in his argument for Cartesian dualism, that there is a distinction between mind and body. Cartesian dualism, we'll see, is taken up by the competing school of empiricism. Even as empiricists and rationalists fundamentally disagree that knowledge depends on the mind and deductive reasoning. So let's look at empiricism. Empiricists argue that knowledge depends on experience, which involves the senses. So John Locke, who we studied last week, was an influential empiricist, and he argued that all knowledge is based off sense experience. He thought that knowing something involves seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, and or touching, and reflecting on these sense experiences. So Locke did, however, maintain Cartesian dualism. In other words, he agreed with Descartes that there is a thing in itself that we don't directly access in our experience. However, it imprints an idea in our mind through the senses. So to understand what an idea is, consider intentional states, such as I believe, I think, I know, I desire, I hope. Okay? Ideas are the blanks. They are the objects of thinking. For instance, I believe that table in front of me is solid. So the ideas here would be table and solid. If you say, I think the elephant is large, the ideas are elephant and large. Locke says that ideas are, quote, whatsoever is the object of the understanding when a person thinks. So Locke uses examples, these examples: whiteness, hardness, sweetness, thinking, motion, man, elephant, army, and drunkenness to illustrate what an idea is. Now, some philosophers think that we humans are born with innate ideas. For instance, Plato thought this. He argued in what's called the myth of air, which is a story of kind of a reincarnation story from ancient Greece, that we know all the forms before we're born, such as the form of justice, what the essence of justice is. And then when we're born, we forget what that form is. So as a result, when we acquire knowledge, that's akin to remembering something that we knew before. So the idea of whiteness, for instance, would be innate for Plato, and we would remember it when we recognize something as white. We wouldn't learn about white, we would remember what white was. And Descartes also thought that we were born with innate ideas. After all, he argued that God exists on the basis of our having an innate idea of infinity. Now, Locke disagrees. He argues that people are born as blank slates. He says, quote, let us then suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. End quote. So we already see a drastic difference between rationalists and empiricists, as rationalists believe in innate ideas and empiricists don't. So how does our blank papers or our blank slates get filled in? Locke argues that it's filled in with ideas gathered from experience. So our experience provides us with two sources of knowledge: sensation and reflection. Let's first look at sensation. Sensation refers to everything we see, hear, touch, taste, and smell. For instance, the computer in front of you right now comes to your mind via sensations. Descartes, of course, doubted the things he experienced with the senses, so he denied the senses as a source of knowledge. But Locke argues that you have nothing to even doubt without your senses. What you sense, for instance, cannot be denied because your mind's actions are based on them. Descartes' doubting is never free of sensation. He can't successfully remove himself from the sensible world because all ideas have sense experience as their foundation. In other words, doubting is an intentional state. It is a doubting of a sensation. For instance, Descartes doubts that his body is real. He can only perform such doubting if he had a sense experience of a body in the first place. So as such, all knowledge starts with the senses for Locke. So how is it that we can trust that the sensations we have actually reflect the world? Well, as we saw with Descartes, we have sensations when we are dreaming, and yet the world we believe we are in is not the real world at all. So Locke accepted Cartesian dualism, as we mentioned before. He argues that the mind takes in sensations passively. In other words, there is a thing in itself that imprints a sensation on our mind. And he thinks impressions on the mind are accepted passively by the mind. For instance, take the case of children. According to Locke, children come into the world without any ideas. They're a blank slate. They then start interacting with the world and learning things through their experiences. For instance, they won't know that the oven is hot unless they've experienced heat or a burn. Perhaps they previously touched the oven and learned it the hard way. Otherwise, they might have experienced a burn from something else, and they learned language and they were told that the oven was hot, and they recall this experience and they know that it's a bad experience, and so they refrain from touching that oven. Either way, they'll avoid the hot oven because of a previous experience. But then isn't there a problem? If simple ideas are just sensations, such as color, sweetness, bitterness, noise, etc., how do we divide them up the way we do? Do we really just take in all sensations passively? Don't our minds do something with the sensations to organize the sensations? So take, for instance, this duck-rabbit picture. The simple ideas here just involve black lines. However, different people see different things. There is a way of seeing these lines as a duck or as a rabbit. But you can't see both the duck and a rabbit simultaneously. So how do we go from these raw sensations of black lines to a perception of a duck or a rabbit? So Locke argues that our minds turn inward and we reflect on our experiences. And this is called reflection. As we reflect, we see the image of a duck or the image of a rabbit. He argues that we do this with all objects in the world. If we just consider the simple ideas, the raw sensations themselves, we won't identify objects. So that's why we need reflection. It's an activity of the mind that leads to our understanding of sensations. So through reflection, we understand a duck or a rabbit. And Locke wrote, "Though sensations pass there continually, yet like floating visions, they make not deep impressions enough to leave in their mind clear, distinct, lasting ideas. Till the understanding turns inward upon itself, reflects on its own operations, and makes them the objects of its own contemplation." So the floating visions would be like the black lines. And as the mind turns in on itself and reflects on itself, it sees a duck or a rabbit, which would be a lasting concept. So further, Locke wrote, "In time, the mind comes to reflect on its own operations about the ideas got by sensation, and thereby stores itself with a new set of ideas, which I call ideas of reflection." So this is how we come to see raw sensations as things, like pens, elephants, dogs, desks, people, ducks, rabbits. Now, as we study the ideas in our mind, we'll find that we have simple and complex ideas. So a simple idea will stand alone. It's unmixed. Some examples are hard, brown, and cool. You can't invent these ideas. They are the most basic ideas that make up our knowledge of the world. We also have complex ideas, and these are mixed. They're combined. For instance, hard, brown, and cool is a complex idea. It's a compound idea. United, they help to describe a desk. We can compare simple and complex ideas to chemical elements. Simple ideas are like individual elements, like hydrogen and oxygen. You can't break them down. You can't break down hydrogen into a simpler element. It is the building block. But a complex idea combines simple ideas. It would be like two hydrogens and an oxygen combining to make H2O or water. So Locke notes that almost all our experiences appear to be complex ideas, but they can all be reduced to their simple ideas. So all experience ultimately comes from these simple atomic ideas, and he argues, I would have anyone try to fancy any taste which had never affected his palate, or frame the idea of a scent he had never smelt. And when he can do this, I will also conclude that a blind man hath ideas of colors, and a deaf man true distinct notions of sound. Okay, so that's why he's saying you can't break the simple ideas down further than they are. So everyone can think of an example of a thing that has never existed before. For instance, Sasquatch. That's a complex idea, that something that doesn't exist, presumably. It's made up of many simple ideas, such as solidity, brown, motion, so on. However, can you think of a simple idea that has never existed? For instance, can you provide an example of a color that you've never seen? I don't think so. Simple ideas, then, are the building blocks of knowledge. They are the most basic impressions on the mind that constitute all of our complex ideas. So Locke breaks up simple ideas as follows. There's simple ideas of sensation, which include color, taste, sound, touch, and smell. And there's simple ideas of reflection, which includes solidity, extension, figure, motion or rest, and number. So, some concluding remarks. According to empiricists, all of our knowledge is derived from experience and these simple ideas that we then turn into complex ideas. And according to empiricists, you can't deny the senses like Descartes tries to do. Descartes thinks he's discovering truths that have nothing to do with the senses, but he's wrong because that's impossible. All complex ideas start with simple ideas, which come from the senses. Now, a key problem for Locke is that he believes in an external world that causes our perceptions. But his copy theory, as our textbook calls it, involves a thing in itself, something that causes the ideas in our mind that we don't experience directly. We experience the copy. And yet the thing in itself is the source of all the ideas in our minds. So if all we have are the ideas in our minds, how can we know that our senses aren't deceiving us, or that we've invented complex ideas that don't reflect the actual world? And this is the source of empiricist David Hume's skepticism. And our textbook does a good job going over his arguments. So I'm not going to go and get into his arguments during this lecture, but please email me if you have any questions about it. So I'm actually going to end my lecture here with Locke, but I went much further into his arguments than our textbook did, so it should help illuminate many of Hume's concerns. Of course, let me know again if you have any questions about any parts of this lecture or about the week's reading, and I'm available by email and also happy to meet with you on the Clark campus by appointment Tuesdays and Thursdays. Okay, have a great week. I will see you in the discussion forum.